Chapter 19. The Losers. Jack felt so stupid. He was lying face down in the dirt, his rear end pointed straight at the sky. His limbs seemed to have turned to stone, a horrible tingling numbness spreading through him, as though he'd fallen asleep on his arm. Only it wasn't just his arms, it was his everything. He focused hard, trying to curl a fist, to bend an elbow. If he could make even the smallest movement, he knew he could break free. But it was useless. He could no sooner bend a single fingertip than float into the air and levitate around. Another minute or so passed, and a horn blared in the distance, signaling the end of the match. But the paralysis didn't change. He remained as motionless as a statue. The soft sound of footsteps broke the silence. In his peripheral, a pair of legs came into view, standing near Maddie.
"Yeah, she's right here,"
an adult voice said.
"I just cover her eyes then?"
What must this guy be seeing? Jack wondered if everyone else looked as ridiculous as he did, with his butt pointed upward and his face planted in the dirt. A voice crackled through the static of a walkie-talkie. The newcomer squatted down, and Jack could see the familiar blue of a staff shirt. The official made a motion with his arm toward Maddie, and Jack felt mobility flood back into him like water filling a sack. Limbs loosening, he sank to the floor, then shook his paws at the uncomfortable tingling. His knees knocked together as he stood and turned around.
"What is with you?"
the shrew demanded. He looked between Maddie and Jack, seeming unsure of who to blame, then roared in frustration and stomped away. Maddie was angrily readjusting her patrol cap. Jack looked in the direction she had been facing. A bright line of sunlight was gleaming off the rim of a high wall. He must have spun her right toward it.
"Well, that's that,"
Sprint said, looking down at the flag in his paws.
"It hasn't been 15 minutes. The other team must have made it. We're out."
Outside of the arena, the victorious teams were euphoric. They slapped high fives, pounced happily on each other's backs, and exchanged stories of their adventures into the maze. But when they were led away by officials, they left behind a rather gloomy mood. The losing teams had almost all broken apart. Some sat along the raised arena ramp, crying, commiserating, or stewing in disillusioned silence. Others seemed to decide that, now that it was all over, they might as well get started heading home. A row of tram cars were parked just before the arena entrance, their fiberglass benches filled with silent, disappointed teens waiting to be shuttled toward the harbor.
"We came close,"
Sprint said, standing just before the tram.
"Just a little bad luck at the end."
Jack shifted uncomfortably.
"Or we all just failed hard,"
Willie groused. He strode off toward one of the southward-pointing trams without another word. A moment later, that tram started off, and Willie was gone without even a backward glance.
"Who knows?" Sprint started again. "Now that they've reopened the Sidekick program, maybe we'll be invited back next."
He trailed off as a cheerful voice boomed nearby. Jack turned to see the Giraffes team, the team they had lost to, striding past.
"I said, if you want our flag, you'll have to get past me, princess,"
the giraffe gloated, to the appreciative laughter of his teammates. Sprint grimaced, his shoulders stiffening as the group passed behind him.
"That noodle neck," he growled. "I mean, we had their flag. If not for Maddie, we definitely would have won."
Maddie sat alone in the rearmost car, her arms folded across her chest, wearing an expression of suppressed confusion. She looked, Jack thought, as though she'd been lied to, and was trying not to show how much that hurt.
"Well, see ya,"
Sprint said, nodding to Jack as he climbed into the nearest car.
"Yeah, see ya,"
Jack sighed, nodding to Hoover. The anteater nodded in return, then slid onto the bench next to Sprint. Jack turned toward the rear of the tram and began along the path. As he passed Maddie, she looked pointedly in the other direction, and his half-raised paw dropped to his side. Now to find Alan. Jack had last seen the fox at the convention center, so he figured he'd head that way. Alan was his legal guardian now, although he hadn't seemed too thrilled about the fact. The fox was ambitious and important. Perhaps he thought that Jack would only get in his way. Where did he live? Somewhere in the city, no doubt. But Alan was a young bachelor. It seemed unlikely he would have a spare bedroom for Jack. Would he have to sleep in the attic again, like when he'd lived with the Punts? Would he be stuck there while Alan was at work? He let out a disappointed sigh. If only he hadn't knocked Maddie over.
Jack! Hey, there you are!
Jack looked up. Mr. Behr was striding up the path, his paws stretched wide as he approached. Jack was surprised to see Willie following behind, walking briskly to keep up with the much taller dog, and looking very confused.
Hi,
Jack said as they drew near. Behr didn't stop, though. He passed Jack and motioned for him to follow.
Quickly now, he said. We don't have much time.
His coat trailed behind him as he took off at a jog.
Hold that tram,
he shouted, waving his paws over his head. The tram, which had started off toward the north gate, slowed to a stop. Behr waved thanks to the driver as he reached the rearmost car, where Maddie was seated. He said something Jack couldn't hear. Looking as confused as Willie, as confused as Jack himself felt, she slid off the bench as Behr walked to the next car, where Sprint and Hoover were watching him with interest. He said something to them, they exchanged a glance, then dropped down off of the tramcar and followed Behr as he turned once more toward Jack.
Follow me,
he said as he passed again, and Jack and Willie spun on their heels. The six of them moved along the pathway as it wound between well-manicured lawns, beneath a sky bridge connecting two buildings, finally arriving at a door in the building on the left. White letters were stenciled onto the windows of the door, reading Kelly Hall.
So, did we make it?
Maddie asked.
Are we in?
Beyond the door, a voice seemed to be addressing a crowd through a microphone. One paw on the door handle, Behr cleared his throat.
No. I suppose I should explain, he said. We don't have any more spaces available for apprenticeships, unfortunately. I'm sorry it didn't work out.
He paused.
But we were watching you in that maze, you know. We had cameras, and your team, well, you made a good impression on some important folks, including the president.
He nodded around at them, smiling.
So, he began again, clapping his paws together, how would the 5 of you like to come work for me?
For you? Sprint said.
Well, in so many words, really you'll be working for animal control. It won't be an apprenticeship. We had 8 teams of heroes ready to receive 8 teams of sidekicks. All of those spots are now full. However, there is a need to get more porters around here.
The word was familiar to Jack. He remembered the dog from that morning, the one that had teleported into the fountain.
Porters,
Willie said, crossing his arms.
You mean like errand boys?
Boys? Maddie asked.
My son Jay was a porter, Behr said. He loved it, but he's off to live with his mother next week. So? He spread his paws wide. Think of it as an internship, he continued with a smile. You will spend your days helping in the mailroom, or running copies around the campus. It might not be glamorous, but you get to stay here, make connections and all that.
He straightened up and stuck his thumbs in his coat pockets.
So what do you say?
Jack and Sprint exchanged glances. Sprint looked to Hoover.
Count me in,
said Maddie.
Us too,
said Sprint. Hoover nodded.
If it's the best we can get, said the frog. Sure, I'm in.
Behr turned to Jack.
How about it, Jack?
The sky had turned a pleasant shade of pink, the air warm and fragrant. He couldn't think of anywhere he would rather be.
Yeah,
he said, smiling around at the squirrel, the anteater, the frog, the doe, his new team.
Let's do it.
Excellent, Behr grinned, and he yanked open the door. The amplified voice inside became clearer. Behr motioned for the group to enter.
Sounds like we'll just catch the tail end of the welcome ceremony.